So I want to talk a little bit today about the question of death. So I grew up Catholic, and the Catholic system when it comes to life after death is unambiguous. Like, I remember being a grade schooler, and we had this little one classroom school that my parents started with some other very Catholic parents. I remember we had one teacher for all the kids, and her name was Mrs. Bame. And one day Mrs. Bame explained to us, you're born with two things. You're born with well, maybe three things. You're born with a soul, free will, and a lifetime, okay? You get these three things, and you have to use your free will to make choices that are congruent with the 10 Commandments so that you fill your soul with good deeds. Why? Because this life ain't all there is to it. When you die, Mrs. Bame told us, you go to either heaven or hell. And I don't remember her ever torturing us with visions of everlasting fire, but she did paint a portrait of hell that was unpleasant. And the portrait of heaven that she painted was not exactly pleasant, but we got the point. Like, I remember her talking about how it's like a grand ballroom filled with glass chandeliers and light, and there's angels playing a piano, and there are beautiful, wonderful people walking around, and all your relatives that have died are there. And I remember thinking, this sounds like a really bad family reunion held at like the Kiwanis Club or something. But okay, I get the point. Heaven's a great place. We want to go there. It's easy to make fun of the Mrs. Bames of the world as sweet and well-intentioned but unsophisticated. However, unless you're a complete moron, you do find yourself asking, is this all there is to it? And the reason why that monotheistic, Catholic, and other monotheisms point of view about an afterlife is so strong is because it answers this question. So my teacher was a Rinzai Zen master who, he was, I think he was close to 100 years old when I met him. I think he was 98 when I did my first koan session with him. He was 108-year-old when he died, and I was there on his deathbed. I was there when he died, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in this video. But he talked about death probably every day of his life that I knew him. But never, ever was the air around this discussion of death or the air around my teacher morbid. Never. There was no morbidity in the air at all. I remember one time, it was after my teacher became very ill, came home from the hospital, and I remember one morning it was taken a long time to get him out of bed, and he was in a lot of pain. And I remember looking in his eyes, and he had a little bit of a smile on his face, and his countenance was always very bright and very alive and not morbid, no matter how much suffering he was going in or how much of that old man vibe he was giving off. There was always some life in his eyes. And I remember stopping and looking at him, and I was like, what, Roshi? What? And he said, oh, Roshi dying. But dying activity, very interesting. So what did Roshi mean by death activity? In the style of Zen that I was taught and that I try and practice, death is not something that happens to us or happens to objective beings out in the world. Death is one half of the activity that gives rise to me. The other half is life. You have the life activity and you have the death activity. So in one of Roshi's lectures, his teishos, he said, and I quote, "To say it simply, what we mean by the resolute or the true Zen practitioner is the person who makes it their business to make these two mutually opposing activities, the activity of living and the activity of dying, both completely their content." Within this cosmos, there is a principle at work, and the principle is mutually opposing but complementary activities, giving rise to everything. So in our case, the mutually opposing complementary activities of life and death give rise to us. Now we're doing the living activity right now, but marbled in equally with that living activity as we're alive is the death activity. So yesterday died and today was born. Today is going to die and tomorrow is going to be born. Within this one cosmos, there are these activities of life and death. And as Roshi says, we have to learn to completely manifest the death activity. When you give yourself to an activity or give yourself to something, that self, that moment, it dies, and then a new self and a new moment is born. So my experience of working with my teacher when he was very, very old was that he really, even as an old man, he was never full of sludge. He was never full of a static or a whiny or kind of a stinky, stale, stagnant energy. He was giving himself to the circumstances and engaging with them, making relationship is how he talked about it. And then generally speaking, if there was some kind of struggle that was going on because of his old age, the situation would shift somehow, and he would be reborn out the other end in a different mood with a different quality to the moment. One of the main differences between the monotheistic Mrs. Bame point of view, the Catholic point of view from the grade school of my youth that I talked about earlier, and the Sasaki Roshi Tathagata Zen point of view is the difference between faith and trust. So the Catholic Christian point of view that I was raised in asked me to have faith. Faith that when you die, you will be reborn instantly as someone in heaven or hell. You just simply have to believe. It's like an act of mental willpower, faith. Trust is different. Trust is natural. And trust comes from, as I saw with my teacher, a lifetime of curiosity. That was the thing that I always got from Roshi. He had a curiosity about his body. He kind of enjoyed watching it fall apart. He was not attached to his life as it began to slowly slip away. He had kind of a curiosity about it. He was manifesting the death activity. And I think, now I'm speaking for my teacher, but I mean, I'm trying to get across sort of what I witnessed when this very, very old Zen master began to die, because you can see the fruits of a lifetime of practice manifesting in those final years. So is there a life after death? I really don't know. But I remember just off the top of my head, there was one retreat that I was in at the monastery, And it was really, really, really difficult. I had a monk who was somewhat sociopathic, and he was my superior, and he was trying to get another student kicked out of the Zen center because he didn't like him. And it was the middle of winter, and I'd had no sleep, and I had a cold, and I was so down and depressed and full of despair, which is one of the despair is like this perfectly horrible marriage of anxiety dialed up to 10 and depression dialed up to 10. And that's what I was experiencing in that moment. And I remember taking not even taking that, and I remember just dying on the cushion. I surrendered. I don't know what it was. It was a surrender. Something shifted, the bottom dropped out, and I just let it go. And it was literally like a feeling of death, like I'd perished on the cushion. My mind state lost its heartbeat. And then the Jikijitsu rang the bell, which signaled the end of the sit, and we all got up, and I remember feeling reborn. The situation hadn't changed. That sociopathic monk was still trying to kick that student out of the Zen center, but I felt like this new force of energy coming up inside me. And I wasn't alone in this type of experience. Many of us, we were taught to die on the cushion. We were taught to die on the cushion over and over and over. That's all we were taught. I think that's what Roshi meant when he said, do the dying activity. And when you did that dying activity by giving yourself to sitting on the cushion and surrendering, when you did that dying activity, a new self was always born in the next moment. So Zen approaches death, I think, with this feeling of trust, intimacy, and participation in the process of death. And I think this is really neat because it doesn't separate us from this natural activity of dying. It doesn't make death the enemy. As I mentioned earlier, it was always hard for Roshi as he was dying. It was physically painful, but death was never the enemy. So while I don't like to say, yes, there's an afterlife, or I also don't like to say, no, there's no afterlife. Ultimately, we don't know. There's the great Zen story about someone asking a master, what happens after I die? And the master says, don't know. Why are you asking me? And the guy says, because you're a Zen master. And the Zen master says, but I'm not a dead Zen master. I always love that story. It perfectly encapsulates how I feel about the question of life after death. But it's not a question that causes me a ton of consternation either. Because I trust the process of living and dying. It's not easy, and I'm not good at it, but fundamentally, I think I trust it. Hey friends, thanks for joining me today. This is a view from the Alps near the Zen Retreat Center that's run and owned by a community that I'm close to here. And I was with them a couple weeks ago when we had a big discussion about life after death, and that's what gave me the inspiration for this video. Anyways, if you liked this video, you can support me on Patreon as well as PayPal. And you can hit the subscribe and the like button. Much love to you folks. See you next week. Bye-bye.